Hello! We're going to be covering Chapter 5, Part 1 in this slideshow. We're going to be discussing governmental crime. So let's review the definitions. A government crime covers the whole range of crimes committed within governmental circumstances. So corruption, bribery, abuse of power, all of those fun things. State crime are harmful activities carried out by the state on behalf of a state agency. And we're going to go into a lot more detail about that in this slideshow. Political white-collar crime, illegal activities carried out by officials and politicians for direct personal benefit. So, a lot of times you'll see politicians taking bribes for their own personal well-being, and obviously they're using their power to get this money. So let's look at the characteristics of a government criminal. Respectable status. They occupy a position of trust. They have moderate to high income. They clearly do not see themselves as criminals, and they are motivated by money and or power. We have on the left Jesse Jackson Jr., son of Jesse Jackson, the great civil rights leader. He was an Illinois congressman who misused his campaign funds for a lavish lifestyle. Then we have Albert Bustamante from Texas. He was accepting bribes. And then we have Rick Renzi from Arizona, who was caught in a web of fraud and corruption. So all three of these people were elected to office, held a high position of trust, and clearly did not see themselves as criminals. Now, one of the big issues in any kind of government crime is this accusation of bipartisanship or partisanship, where, for example, when Jesse Jackson Jr. was caught with his hand in the cookie jar, a lot of people came out and said it was just the Republicans picking on the Democrat. And when a Republican is caught with his hand in the cookie jar, like Congressman Renzi, then the accusation is that the Democrats are picking on him. So that tends to be the very first way of defending oneself, is that they did nothing wrong, and it's just the Democrats hate the Republicans and the Republicans hate the Democrats. And in other words, one party's claim of repression is another party's ideological stance. One of the most common white-collar crimes in government is called abuse of power. And this occurs when the state assumes and exercises power it ought not to have. One of the biggest issues going on today is the National Security Agency, the NSA, has been accused of abusing their power because they are in fact tracking American citizens via our smartphones. Of course, this would violate the sense of privacy that we're supposed to have, but this has been going on since 9/11, and essentially, when people are afraid, and this is what happened after 9/11, people gave up their rights. They said, we would like to be secure in our country, and we are willing to allow the government to keep an eye on things in order to ensure we're safe. So, the validation is there. They validate this by saying they're keeping us safe from terrorists' abuse. And again, now that we're multiple years, over a decade away from 9/11, people are beginning to wonder, was it worth it? Corruption. This typically involves the misuse of political office for financial or other material gain. Specifically, it can be applied to acts perpetrated for political advantage. This is former Illinois Governor Rob Blagojevich, and he is spending 14 years in prison for corruption. One of his myriad of crimes was that he tried to sell former Illinois Senate seat belonging to Barack Obama when Obama was elected president. And they have Governor Blagojevich on the phone with various and sundry people, up to and including Jesse Jackson Jr., demanding a certain payout for Blagojevich to basically recommend him as the replacement. Then we have bribery. And then bribery is to take or offer an inducement that improperly influences the performance of a public function. In this particular case, Oklahoma State Representative Randy Terrell is serving a 1 year prison sentence for attempting to bribe an opponent to leave the political race. Personally, I think his biggest mistake was that he only offered $5,000, which is kind of an insult when you think it takes several $100,000 to get elected most of the time. So he clearly insulted whomever turned him in, and now he is in jail for a year. The criminal state. The state is the instrument to commit the crimes against humanity, and the one that we are most aware of is genocide. Genocide, which is also known as ethnic cleansing, is a state policy of mass killing directed at an identifiable group of people. And I have two examples on the next slide. Probably the most famous one was Nazi Germany against the Jews during World War II. There is an estimate somewhere between 6 to 12 million Jews were killed by the Nazis in a 6 or 7 year time period. Most recently, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. did a analysis using birth records as well as the absence of death records for where these people were coming from, and they estimate the number is probably closer to 20 million Jews were annihilated. More recently, in Rwanda, they took out the Tutsis. The Hutus, which is a tribal affiliated group, were very, very much against the Tutsis, another tribal group, and it resulted in over 500,000 people being killed. Women, children, men, it didn't matter. Next, we look at the repressive state. And this is a state that systematically deprives its citizens of fundamental human rights. As an example of a repressive state that we all learned about in elementary school, the American Revolution, as well as the French Revolution, came about because these citizens felt that they were being deprived of their rights by the respective monarchies of Britain and France. Remember the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." So, what are human rights? Human rights are something that's relatively a new concept. It was developed in the 1700s by several philosophers, including Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes. And essentially, it gives the person the right to life, liberty, work, and security at home. And over here, you'll see the United States motto, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When we look at something like this, we have to keep in mind that before the 1700s, the idea that humans had human rights didn't exist. This only came about during the Age of Enlightenment of the 18th century. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in particular, developed a theory or a system called the social contract, and that is where those who are governed and those who govern have an unwritten contract between them. And when those who govern no longer do their job or have become corrupt, then those who are governed will rise up and rebel, which we have seen over and over again. We're going to look at South Africa as a repressive state. Now, just a little bit of history. It was colonized 300 years ago by Great Britain, which basically meant that Great Britain went in with their army and a flag and claimed the country and all of its resources. It essentially turned everyone in South Africa who was of color into a second-class citizen. The entire political system and the financial system were dominated by the white minority. This system was called apartheid, and it was a formal racial discrimination against black people. Now, it was not genocide because the whites of South Africa were not organized to kill the citizens. They were just organized to control the citizens. And this went on for 300 years until 1994, when Great Britain eventually gave up the fight after a lot of international pressure and a lot of financial pressure because American companies did not want to do business with a country that was so repressive. And at that point, Great Britain gave South Africa back to the South Africans. This gentleman is Nelson Mandela. He is somebody who was considered a terrorist, spent 20 years in prison, and then when he came out, he became the elder statesman and president eventually of South Africa. He is now seen as one of the finest political figures of the 20th century. Now we're going to look at the corrupt state. A corrupt state is when government leaders use their positions to enrich themselves. So one of the most flagrant examples of this is President Suharto of Indonesia, who served for 32 years. He used his position as president to steer government contracts for oil, gas, real estate, transportation systems, and banks to his family members and friends, to the tune of $50 billion. When he was finally ousted from office in 1998, he was actually allowed to keep $15 billion of his ill-gotten, embezzled gains, essentially. Now, one would think with corruption, that's the state's problem, that's the country's problem. But a lot of these countries, especially in a poor continent like Africa, really do suffer from the bottom of the rung all the way up to the top. These are a couple of the examples that we're going to look at. Is Mobutu Sese Seko, a leader of Zaire, also known as Congo, took control of $3 billion in assets. And that's this guy up here. The Nigerian government leadership is suspected of stealing more than $400 billion. Nigeria has the potential to be one of the most powerful countries in Africa and an incredibly powerful country in the world because they have that wonderful resource of oil. And yet the government leadership is so corrupt that it takes all of the money that could be used for infrastructure and developing an economy, and they just loot the country. The last gentleman over here, Charles Taylor, he was the leader of Liberia, and he was alleged to have stolen as much as $100 million. So these guys that are stealing the money, how does it affect their people? In a very simple way, it basically makes other countries reluctant to send aid money. So in Congo and in Liberia, where there were civil wars, the United States, China, Russia, Europe were not inclined to help because they know that if they sent aid money, it would go right into the pockets of these corrupt leaders. So a lot of governments are reluctant to help out a corrupt leader or a corrupt country because they know the money will be wasted on the personal fortunes of these kind of people. Next, we're going to look at state negligence. State negligence are crimes of omission, things that were not done. So, for example, the state fails to prevent the loss of human life, suffering, and deprivation that are in its power to prevent. Can also include when resources are wasted through gross inefficiencies, negligence, and incompetence. And we're going to have two examples we're going to look at here. First was during the era of Ronald Reagan from 1980 to 1988. One of the things that he did that he got a lot of criticism for was he cut health programs for poor pregnant women and children, which resulted in the United States having a very high infant mortality rate amongst the poor. And overall, when you looked at infant mortality, our rates were commensurate with what you would see with third world countries. It was horrifying to the world that we were not helping pregnant women and children. But in terms of a political sensibility, this was very much in line with what Reagan was doing. One of the other things he did was he closed down state mental institutions. So people who had serious mental disorders were basically given $5 and their clothing and told to go handle their lives, which is why the rise in homelessness skyrocketed through the 90s. Another thing that Ronald Reagan did that really upset a lot of people was he refused to acknowledge the AIDS crisis of the late 1980s. This meant that no funding money from the government was spent to try and prevent or treat AIDS, which led to thousands of people dying, very young people dying. And, a bigger issue is that we were very far behind in AIDS research. So when the first government that was able to fund the research actually had medications that would help treat these people, the first government was France. And they made a lot of money off of this. So it was often seen as a short sighted plan on Reagan's part, and the United States definitely had to catch up. It's the same thing that happened during Bush's reign when he cut stem cell funding. Other countries like Russia, China, France are way ahead of the United States. It was one of the first things that Obama did when he came into office was he opened up stem cell research funds again. Medical practitioners truly believe that this is the wave of the future, to be able to use a person's DNA to heal their own bodies. And, we're catching up, but we definitely started with a deficit because of that. Last but not least, we have more recently Bush's lack of management during the Hurricane Katrina disaster. Um, Before the storm even hit Louisiana, people were saying, and I'm not talking about just people on the street, but I'm talking engineers, meteorologists said that this storm could take out the levees in Louisiana. And that's what holds the water back from hitting the city, because the city is under sea level. The declaration of disaster was not signed till a couple days after Katrina hit. And it took many more days to mobilize people to get to Louisiana. And in the meantime, people were dying, people were drowning, they were dying of heat stroke. And George W. Bush got a lot of criticism that he did not move quickly enough to ensure that the resources that were needed to deal with this unimaginable tragedy were in place in a timely manner. So we're going to stop here. The quiz will include the second half of Chapter 4 and up to this point in Chapter 5. And then we will start the second half of Chapter 5 after this. If you have any questions, please feel free to text me or email me, and I will see you for the quiz.